Hello, students. This is your friendly instructor for your sophomore lit survey course. I had some questions over the last couple of days trying to clarify for students the difference between modernism and postmodernism. And that is a really good question. There are a lot of similarities between those two movements. So I wanted to give you just a few minutes of kind of a mini lecture to see if I can clarify that for you so that when it comes to the exam, you'll be able to talk about it with some confidence. So to revisit modernism, which, as you recall, begins right after the turn of the 20th century. In the United States, especially, we associate it with World War I, especially the end of World War I, where people were sort of reeling in the aftermath of that, feeling that all the things that they used to believe in, they weren't so sure they could believe in them anymore because of all the trauma that came at a time when they thought progress had moved us beyond the kind of violence and turmoil of that period. So some of the key qualities of the modernist movement are a loss of faith in tradition, a loss of faith in the myths of the past. So even a little bit of a loss of faith in the Enlightenment principles. They thought we were becoming better and better as a species, and somehow we still go out and just, get in the muck and try to kill each other. So there was a lot of questioning faith in Christianity and all of those kind of major belief systems. But they did end up, even though the world of the modernist is characterized by fragmentation, the modernists had the sense that the artist can help us move forward, that they can take the fragments and they can pull those together and make something beautiful of them. And the kind of work that they would create would have a unity to it. So if you remember, when we look at T.S. Eliot, we read the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. He's feeling very aimless. He's a good symbol of the lost generation, the person that now feels like they don't know what their purpose is. They've kind of lost their energy. He's got this kind of symbolic impotence, a loss of power. In The Wasteland, which we did not read, but is an important work by Eliot, he has the line, "These fragments I will shore against our ruin." Shoring the fragments together against our ruin is kind of what the poem does. It takes all these fragments of different myths and parts of human civilization and it builds something beautiful out of them in the poem itself. So the poem has a kind of it's a little dark, but it kind of leaves us with a sense that we will be able to survive. We will be able to find beauty again. Now, something different in the postmodern movement, which starts around the 50s, 1950s. One reason it starts then is because of the media, because our lives began to be filled with visual images much more than before because of television. And now we are kind of in the postmodern period, but we still are basically children of the postmodern era because our lives are filled with constant images from billboards, commercials, magazines, and now we have the internet. So we've got all these different kind of visual things that represent our reality for us, and we know we can't completely trust them, right? That there's somebody out there trying to kind of shape our reality for us, and so we've got to always be aware that reality has a little bit of a falseness to it. Now, it also is based on the idea of a fragmented reality. That even inside us, that we're somewhat fragmented, that we aren't even completely unified inside ourselves. We might be one person at one moment and another person at another moment, and maybe those two selves can't always be reconciled to each other. So they believe that the world maybe doesn't make sense, unlike the modernists who think maybe we can make some sense out of it. The postmodernists kind of stop trying to do that. And in some ways, they sort of play with the fragments. And in a way, there's a kind of joy in that play. They're almost like tricksters in a way, and that they sort of take pleasure in pulling things apart. So instead of trying to take all the fragments and make something whole out of them and sort of heal from that, they sort of, whenever someone does that, kind of builds something and makes it feel like a whole, they come in and sort of start pulling it apart again. So there is a kind of play associated with postmodernism, but there are some things that I want you to remember about them. There are several concepts that will help you identify postmodernism and the works that are written during the postmodern movement. So here they are. Number one, metafiction, which is kind of being conscious that you are fiction. So if you're a character in a novel, you might say to the reader, hey, stop turning the page. You haven't finished hearing what I was going to say. Sort of reminding the reader that they're looking at a piece of paper and that this is this kind of constructed activity that we're doing. That the narrative itself is something that was constructed. It's not just a reflection of reality. Number two, that the signifier and the signified don't always have a stable relationship. And this is about language. So if we start to question even the stability of language, now we've moved beyond modernism and we're into postmodernism. For postmodernists, language is kind of a suspicious thing. We use it to try to communicate with each other, but it's always a little slippery. So the signifier is the word. It signifies something, right? And the signified is the thing that it represents. So a good example of how this works is in Raymond Carver's Cathedral. We often associate the cathedral with God, with something that's so big and so stable that there's no way you can disrupt it, right? God's bigger than everything. And the cathedral is a symbol of God. However, in that story, you see that the character has completely lost faith in anything and really suffers for it, feels like living is kind of difficult because he doesn't know what to believe in. But what ends up having some meaning for him isn't the cathedral itself, but the little moment of connection he has with the blind man when they try to draw the cathedral together. So it's like for a moment the cathedral has some power again, but it's a kind of fleeting power, right? So it reminds us that language and symbols are not stable. And then the third quality that I want you to remember about postmodernism is that it brings little stories in to challenge the grand narrative. So if the grand narrative is the big narrative that explains what it means to be human, they no longer believe that that narrative completely does its job, right? It's been sort of blown apart. Maybe it's one of the things that's become fragmented. But the good thing about that happening is that it makes some space for the little stories to be told by the voices that haven't always been heard. So let me go back and give some examples of each one of these so that when you go back to your syllabus and you're reviewing, you can see where some of the works we're reading fit postmodernism. So metafiction, diving into the wreck. This is for American Lit. Diving into the wreck, the poem. The diver talks about having read the Book of Myths and bringing it with her on her dive, but understanding that the words are maps. The words aren't the wreck itself. The wreck itself, you've got to get in there and actually look at it, right? You can't just read a book about it because the language that represents the wreck doesn't give us the whole truth. In some ways, it even distorts the truth, right? It kind of gives us a value system that we want to question that. So the diver says, I'm going to go look at the wreck, not the myth of the wreck, not the story of the wreck, but the actual wreck. So it kind of reminds us that the words themselves are suspect, that we should be careful about trusting them too much. Let's see. Also, an example of that. Sorry, we have not read anything else, I don't think, that really fits that part too well. So the World Lit course, you might have a little harder time finding that specific thing. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Actually, Death Constant Beyond Love by Garcia Marquez is a great example of that. You know, that he keeps putting up sets when he goes out, the main character, the senator, when he goes out to give campaign speeches, he brings sets with him, and it says the sets are kind of worn out and they're starting to look kind of bad, but the people don't necessarily notice because they get caught up in his narrative, right? So, and it's a false narrative, so that's an important thing to remember. Examples of the signifier and the signified, I gave the example of cathedral, and then the little stories that often crop up that challenge the grand narrative. We have Mama Day in the American Lit course. The myth of Sapphira comes in and challenges the Christian myth and says, you know what? We can exist side by side. The myth of God doesn't supersede my explanation for how we got here. And so she suggests, let's have our myths kind of just exist together. They don't have to make sense together, but they can exist side by side. I'll Shake in the women's swimming pool also tells a little story. It's about somebody that you normally wouldn't hear from, a young woman that is living in a small village in Lebanon who doesn't have a lot of power because her role in the world is to be, you know, virtuous and not sexual, and to just do her duty and stay in her little village and not question things. And instead, she just has this great curiosity and this desire to go out and see the world, and she's having to choose kind of, and you know, there are pros and cons to the experience of having to depart from the narrative that she's been given as a young woman, because it also means she's going to become maybe disconnected from her grandmother and from the traditions that she's grown up with. But she is a character that you wouldn't normally see in the grand narrative. Most people wouldn't say that she represents humanity. However, if you're open to thinking about it, she does represent some of the things that we all have to deal with in growing up, right? So I hope that gives you a sense of some of the qualities of postmodernism that will help you think about that when you start to review for the exam. Thanks. Bye.